10 years after the last official Total Drama season ended, and over 15 years since the original, we finally got the brand new Total Drama Island a couple of weeks ago. So it's time to do my obligatory deep dive into the season. In this video, we're gonna go over everything surrounding and within the season, including every single new camper, and discuss whether this reboot just feels like Pack-a-2 Part 2, or if it's truly deserving of carrying the name of the legendary first season.
Hey, what's up? I'm here to slay. Don't know why the rest even bother to stay.
If you came into this video not knowing about the newest season of the show being out, that's probably because it's not out where you live, as the season is only released in Italy. You might be wondering why or how so many people are talking about the season if it's only out in Italian, but that's just because, for some reason, they decided to go ahead and release the season in English in its entirety in a way that about 0.5% of English speakers could access legally, which is honestly kind of a disaster for a show like Total Drama with such an online fan base. Now, the reboot is already greenlit for another season, but when they look at viewership numbers to decide on the future of the show after this point, they're likely going to be heavily disappointed by the number of people who either waited until it dropped on Cartoon Network or HBO Max in the country they live in, or have decided to watch it again out of the kindness of their hearts, and if they don't connect the dots regarding the horrific release of the show, it's likely screwed, especially when they likely end up pulling the same thing again for the second season. This obviously sucks for the crew behind the show, as I know they would never want to see it come out in this way, and I hope that it still somehow works out for the series, although every day without any kind of announcement regarding an overseas release is pretty discouraging. Anyway, enough depressing talk, at least for now. Let's go ahead and start talking about the premise for the season, which is kind of interesting. Just like every season before, this one has a gimmick, being that it's fully into being a reboot, even more so than the already reboot season we had back in Revenge of the Island, while also leaning into being Total Drama in the 2020s, with influencers making up a fourth of the cast. While this does sound like it has the potential to be truly horrific as the show desperately tries to keep up with the times, I think that, for the large part, they kind of nail it. There are some parts of this season that feel like adults trying to write hip teens, but that's always been a part of Total Drama, and I think that a good chunk of it is handled pretty well. The reboot aspect does have some weird side effects, like Wawanakwa just suddenly being back without any explanation, but calling it a reboot kind of explains why some things are just different now. The new theme song reflects this emphasis, and while it definitely is getting a little bit too much hate in my opinion, the lyrics are pretty goofy and they probably should have just stuck with the old one. There is kind of this third thing in the season that I struggle to call a gimmick, but in comparison to every other season, this one definitely puts extra emphasis on trying to be inclusive. And as you can probably guess, I think they handle it really well too. The show feels comfortable introducing gay characters and amputees and making some jokes about them without it feeling like they're constantly tiptoeing around everything, which helps it feel more like a bunch of 2023 teenagers on an island and less like a PSA. In general, I was just super impressed with how natural the season felt, as by emphasizing the fact of it being a reboot, it kind of helped it feel like it never skipped a beat from the last couple of seasons of the show, which is arguably the biggest compliment I could give the entire season. But even with the entire, vibe of the show being right, the season could still definitely suck if the ever so important 5 C's were out of whack, so let's talk about those next.
I'm your host, Chris McLean, and this is Total Drama Island!
As you probably read in the title card, I consider the 5 C's to be Chris, Chef, the campers, the challenges, and the comedy, which all go hand in hand and are the driving factors for whether or not a season of Total Drama is good. Starting with Chris, the elephant in the room is obviously his voice change, which if you know what his VA is accused of doing, you'll agree was the right move. While I get that some people think the show should have gone to one of very many people who have proven to do a good impression, I think that giving the role to Terry McGurran, a driving force of the season and somebody who obviously knows Total Drama really well, was the right move. And besides the occasional moment where I hear Don instead of Chris, I think that he did the best possible job nailing Chris's speech patterns and personality to the point that towards the end of the season, it started to feel pretty natural. That's enough about the voice though, as the character itself is arguably the best that Chris has felt in quite a few seasons. After slowly flanderizing after World Tour and getting more and and more distant from the actual campers, it finally feels like the Chris of the first 3 seasons is somewhat back, as he feels more like a character and less like a narrator. The same goes for the second C, Chef, albeit to a lesser degree. After watching his role dwindle in Revenge of the Island and All-Stars before essentially disappearing towards the end of Packet 2, it was nice to see Chef back in the spotlight. Although, if you're expecting the character from the first 3 seasons, you'll be fairly disappointed, as it's just not the same character. Besides just having a VA change just like Chris, although significantly less jarring, Chef has also become the voice of reason rather than the tough military vet of the first 3 seasons, to more so match his Dramarama counterpart. While I would have liked to see him get a challenge where he brings up his military background that was so key to his character in the first season, his new role fits the character fairly well too, and his bromance with Chris feels like the best it has since World Tour, as the pair team up to torture the campers. Speaking of which, I'm gonna end up spending most of this video talking about every single member of the cast, but just to quickly go over the third C, the campers in this season are easily the best set since the original, and with at least one more season of development left, they might end up being the best cast the show ever had, which for a show that's so character focused is really stinking impressive. I really like pretty much every character in this cast, as they pretty much all feel like actual people with a few exceptions and a complete reversal of Packet 2, and they all contribute to the most important of the C's, the comedy. A large chunk is drawn from the final C, the challenges. The challenges this season are perhaps the most bare bone that the show has ever done, with the selfie and the pirate ship ones being the only real standouts, at least in a good way. There are 2 different gross out episodes this time around, the now infamous fart one and perhaps the worst eating challenge the show has ever done. But besides the horrific tapeworm stuff at the end of the ladder, I don't terribly hate either of these. The fart episode especially seems to be getting the declaration as perhaps the worst episode of the entire series, and while yeah, it's weird and borderline suspect, I think that people are perhaps overreacting. But nevertheless, very few of the challenges this time are super duper memorable, and none of them really take over the episode. This sounds like it should really hurt the season, and it perhaps does a little bit at times, but it also allows the characters as much screen time as possible to interact with one another, which allows the comedy to feel quite natural. While some characters have more jokes than others, I feel like everybody has their moments in this season, and not just the more heavily gag-based characters. The season does fall flat in its face when trying to do modern humor multiple times, and I still think that the funniest jokes of the season are the ones that have nothing to do with the fact that we're now in the 2020s. I still think the show balances these 2 types of humor really well, and that there are some standout bits from each category, which ultimately makes this in the upper half of funny seasons in the series, which is perhaps the biggest surprise from the whole thing. More so than I can remember in quite a while did I have to pause the show to stop laughing so I didn't miss another joke. It's actually that consistently funny. And with that, I think I've gone as far as I can into this review without naming a single new character, so buckle up as I go through the entire cast. I'll go vaguely in elimination order, but skip around a bit in order to pair together characters that should be talked about together, so let's go ahead and get into the early season fodder.
I was the strongest player on my team. I'm smart, kind. This is garbage.
This season's emerge comes fairly quickly when only 6 contestants have been eliminated, so I thought I'd group together those who don't have that much screen time, starting with Caleb, whose impact on the season is entirely negligible, and that's by design. While he's definitely set up to have a Justin-esque run in the follow-up season, here his whole purpose is to both be a humorous fake-out, which is a pretty fun gag, but more importantly to show the early strategy of Bowie. Obviously, we'll get to his discussion closer to the end of the video, but demonstrating in literally the first episode that Bowie is completely willing to hurt his own team's chances of winning future challenges to eliminate a perceived threat immediately adds some tension to the character, and that's the perfect impact for an episode 1 elimination to have. Axel is up next, and if you remember Eva from Island, you know Axel. Not exactly the same character, but very similar, and getting the exact same placement doesn't help. At least a justification for elimination elimination feels right, but Axel doesn't get enough screen time to do anything great, and her elimination doesn't have the impact on the show that Caleb's does. Probably the least memorable part of the season for me, which hopefully sets up a bigger role for her in the follow-up season. Next up is Nichelle, who's another example of a seemingly strong competitor being eliminated earlier than expected. While her role as a young action actress is interesting, it kinda lies dormant for a while after the first episode, besides her mini feud with Julia over fake famous versus real famous. Of course though, the most memorable moment in her season is Nichelle wallowing around in the final challenge because she's not actually athletic, and cursing her stunt double Jerry. This scene is genuinely hilarious and makes for one of the most memorable gags of the entire season, and I just love everyone's reactions to it. It's the perfect total drama joke as we just get to watch Scary Girl and the ferocious Trout slowly catch up while Nichelle just sobs on the ground, and it makes for one of my favorite scenes of the entire season, giving Nichelle one nice memorable moment before she's gone. Speaking of Scary Girl, or Lauren as the show refers to her once, she's next on the list and is the most gimmicky of characters this time around. While she would seem less out of place in a season like Revenge of the Island or especially Pocket 2, here she kinda sticks out like a sore thumb, and I think she's really a bit too much to fit in. Sure, there are some times in which her existence of the show is justified, such as her domination of the challenge before her elimination episode, but at least in this season, I found most of her lines to be more forced than funny, and her design is kind of wasted in that regard. I think that she has some potential in the next season, although if I had to bet on a character who will get eliminated early again, I think she might be my pick. Damien though, who's up next, I think is actually poised to make a bigger run, and is probably my pick to win the next season, although his appearance in this season is slightly disappointing. We've had people who wanted to quit before, and while the idea of somebody coming in who doesn't know what total drama is sounds interesting, they eliminate him early with a pretty flat gag after he gets fairly limited screen time. His lack of any real dynamic with any other campers really dooms him to be fairly forgettable, although his little moment with Scary Girl could have perhaps been expanded upon if they weren't both immediately eliminated in the next two episodes. Finally in this section is who I believe will face Damien in the finale of the next season, being Mary Kate or MK, who is by far the most developed character we've talked about so far. Still no real dynamic with anybody else in the cast, which is what really all six of these characters have in common, but her usually funny sarcastic comments and hacking subplot actually make her stand out. Hacking into the confession tapes is a really fun direction that's surprisingly never been done before in the show, and the fact that it comes back later, even after she's gone, makes the whole season flow really well. She even gets an all too rare third attribute for a pre-merge contestant, being her kleptomania, which fits in with her sneaky character and gives a good excuse for her elimination, although it could have used more time in order to make it not feel like Julia plot armor. All six of these characters have a good chance to have a bigger role in the next season, but here they mostly just do a pretty solid job in providing fodder for the other characters to survive more episodes, and their lack of relationships with those other characters means that it's not too devastating to see them go. But yeah, with those guys out of the way, we can go ahead and talk about the next set of characters, the post-merge gag machines.
What you writing, nerd? Words?
All four of the characters in this section are guys who are largely humor-based characters, and of course are eliminated back to back to back to back. Going in elimination order, out of the four pairs of characters to go into any season of Total Drama already knowing each other, the Hockey Bros, Wayne and Raj, are pretty easily the best, as their friendship is tangibly wholesome. From the start, they're some of the least apologetically Canadian characters in a show that feels like it's constantly getting less Canadian, as their constant hockey references and Canadian lingo makes for some of the best consistent form of comedy in the season. In general, I just love how positive these guys are, and they kind of establish themselves as the leaders of their team to a great effect early on, without anybody really coming up with a reason to dislike them. These two just being friends make up a good chunk of their dynamic early on, but after Raj's relationship with Bowie begins to become apparent, their plot for the rest of the season is Wayne trying to get Raj to come come out to him. It's handled really well here, and I'm glad they chose to go the positive ending route versus some kind of moral about not outing somebody, which is definitely where I thought they were going, and definitely would have not worked out given the whole reality show aspect of the series. Their joint elimination works to further show their bond and not force either one to have to develop without the other, to fittingly pass the baton of Pain Magnet to Bowie for the rest of the season, and to give the show an out from having to justify them getting voted off. Great pair of characters and some of my favorites from the season. Next up is Ripper, and guys, I have to announce something. Despite widespread hatred for the character, I have to reveal that I am indeed a Ripper apologist, as he's my pick for the funniest character of the season. I get that some find it annoying that he's constantly bullying other campers, and that his name is literally a fart joke, but the name calling fits so perfectly with the slightly subdued cast compared to normal, and the world record attempts is perhaps the funniest fart joke in this entire series that's had a lot of fart jokes. Every time he would refer to himself as an alpha male or scream nerd at whoever on his team was unfortunate enough to state a fact, I couldn't stop myself from laughing. I get that he's almost certainly getting the boot early next time around, as characters who make it far in their debut who are kind of unpopular tend to do, but for the time that we had him, I think that I might have appreciated Ripper more than anybody else who has watched the series. Ripper also has some fun moments in the finale, but I'm saving that for the end, so let's go ahead and move into the reverse Ripper and the final character for this section, Z. Without ever explicitly saying it, given the show's status as a kid series, Z is definitely the stoner of the season, and he fills that role perfectly. He has some of the best gags in all 13 episodes, and I especially love the soda that constantly appears in his hands, along with the hallucinations up in the sky. Also, he's the amputee for the season, and I love how the show handled it. The series is never afraid to make jokes about it, and it keeps it as a side aspect of his character that's hardly mentioned beyond the reveal. Perfect way to handle it, as it just adds to Z's demeanor as the floater of the season in more ways than one. His elimination makes a lot of sense too, as they find a way to get such a likable guy voted off in a way that seems somewhat natural. The 4 guys in this category make up about half the jokes in the season, and an even higher percentage of the most funny jokes of the season, and if I had to pick a favorite group, it would be this one, as while every other one has some significant issues, this group feels like the most total drama to me in a way that helps the season a ton. Anyway, enough positivity, let's complain for a little bit and talk about Chase and Emma.
While we were broken up, I said some awful things about Chase, and you agreed with me. How dare you?
For the first half or so of the season, Emma was one of my favorite characters. For reasons that I don't quite understand, I was somehow dumb enough to think that there was a chance that she wasn't going to get back together with Chase, so watching her prey on his downfall for 22 minutes an episode was a delight, and her chaotic energy really stood out to me compared to a lot of the well put together females of the season. Her friendship with Bowie was really fun to see too, as the scenes with the two of them discussing the state of the island feel like some of the best written scenes of the entire season. But of course, nothing that's good can last, as at about the midway point of the season, it becomes painfully obvious what the end game for Emma is, which is to crawl back to Chase in the only case of derailment in a season that seems to do a good job in avoiding it. Chase is another character that people seem to be hating, but I really don't get how you can hate somebody who is literally nothing. Seriously, more so than some of the characters that get eliminated in the first couple of episodes, Chase is just a net zero of a camper whose gimmick is having a lack of character development. The Emma and Chase relationship is set up from the beginning to be subversive, but the subversive part of it all ends up being that it's not very good in a season that is actually good. Chase not apologizing at all seems to be what's actually supposed to be subversive about the whole thing, but it kind of just ends up making everything seem purposeless, as the whole making up, breaking up, making up thing that occurs in like 3 episodes is exhausting and a great way to ruin a great character in Emma. Her last 2 characters even make sure to showcase her potential before ruining the best aspect of her character and her friendship with Bowie and sending her off the island because of it. At least she gets some time to shine solo in the selfie challenge whenever she's not talking about Chase, but besides that, the ending to her season is quite disappointing. And while one can hope that she'll get some redemption in the next season, I see a Jeff and Bridget early elimination for her and Chase far more likely. Overall, this pair ends up being the least good group of the season, as after the hilarious reveal that their breakup was caused by Chase cutting Emma's brakes, the rest of the season feels like watching her slowly approach the animal hospital in the car that she can't stop. Anyway, enough talking about characters that I hate to hate, let's talk about characters that I love to hate in the form of the villains of the season.
Now, where were we?
Fighting.
All right.
Just like Pakitu, this season has dual antagonists, with Julia serving more as a Heather-type antagonist, and Bowie serving as more of an Alejandro-type protagonist, but possible to root for. Starting off with Julia, I love how she begins the season as the stereotypical brain-dead influencer before suddenly switching into a psychopathic villain for the season. It feels like one of the better ways that the season makes fun of the modern generation, and having a villain that isn't super smart and strategic and is kind of just a jerk to everybody is kind of refreshing. The show kind of has a bad habit of showing strategy in a negative light, but in this season they don't really do that, and I like having a bad guy who's able to survive by just refusing to lose challenges. Her disses of different people on the island have some great jokes within, and out of the 4 influencers on the island, she ends up having the longest and the most consistently good run of them all. Her feud with Bowie is a nice way to involve both of their characters in a really interesting way for a couple of episodes after Raj gets kicked off, and given her status as a low-key villain compared to the likes of Heather or Alejandro, a more low-key defeat at the hands of Bowie feels fitting. Speaking of which, Bowie serves as a finalist for the season, and thus is the male protagonist, and is genuinely one of the most interesting characters of the entire franchise. Besides just the obvious thing that sets him apart, which we'll get to in a moment, we gotta talk about the strategy element of his game, which is ridiculously fun to watch. Watching him do things to try to actually win the game instead of just constantly acting off of his own emotions is not actually presented as some kind of villainous mania as Total Drama usually does, and they really nail it here. The whole reality show element of the show is just genuinely well written throughout this season, and it's clear that more so perhaps than any other season, that there were definitely some tables and vote counting in the writer's room to make sure that everything makes sense within the competition of the show, and to my knowledge, it actually does. You hear campers mention vote counts and trying to actually eliminate threats, and it makes the whole thing feel more like a reality show than it has since Island, and maybe even more so than then. Of course, the main thing that Bowie has that makes him stand out on the surface is being the first openly gay contestant on the show, and yeah, as I mentioned before, they do a really good job handling it here too. The show does a good job making it a big deal for the actual series, but not the show within the show, if that makes any sense. Raj and Bowie end up being the only couple that forms within the season, and I think that it's handled well in the classic slow build-up Total Drama fashion, and Bowie actually being smart enough to put his relationship to the side was surprising, but definitely helps build his reputation as one of the 2 best competitors in the season, as he pretty much coasts into the finale. His magnum opus, though, is perhaps what he pulls with the final 2 characters that we've yet to talk about, being the Ripper-designated nerds.
The nerds have the power!
Right now, the nerds probably think they have the power.
Starting with Millie, her arc is fairly easy to see coming from the jump, as she starts as the born in the wrong generation girl before realizing that having friends is more fun than just being lonely. She's the ultimate example of being a floater in the season, as her entire existence is relative to Priya, and she has nothing going on with anybody else, which is definitely kind of boring, but it does give us time to meet our Zoe/Sky of the season, Priya. The idea of a character being forced by their parents to train for Total Drama is a really creative idea that only works in this reboot kind of format, and I was impressed by how they handled it. Yes, they do inadvertently justify it by handing her the $1 million at the end, but the fact that they portray it as borderline child abuse is further than I thought they would go, and most of the time, the cutaway gags of a younger Priya training for a very specific circumstance are actually fairly funny. This pairing is really interesting in exactly one way, which is that the show switches which one of them is the needy one back and forth between the episodes until it becomes clear at the end that they are heavily reliant on each other, which obviously works really well to set up the reveal to Priya that Millie has been writing about her parental abuse in her journal, which comes to light in what is genuinely one of the best scenes to ever come out of the show, in this really well written and actually somewhat emotional scene, which is something pretty rare in Total Drama. The staging of the scene too, with Bowie just listening in as Priya feels genuine betrayal and Millie loses the only friend she's ever had, yeah, it's a pretty stellar scene. And I love how it ends with Bowie preemptively celebrating his $1 million after the breakup of the Super Alliance. The shattering of this relationship sets the scene for the next episode, which, since it's largely about their friendship, I'll go ahead and transition into the terribly named finale, I Lava This Game.
Yeah! More Ripper screen time for the lucky viewers.
The finale starts off right where the last episode ended, with Millie being depressed at losing her one and only friend, and Priya prepping for revenge. The first half of the challenge is fairly simple at the surface, with the lava twist really only serving to raise the stakes, as it pretty much just boils down to make raft cross lake. Bringing back past campers as helpers is one of my favorite finale tropes, so I'm glad they brought it back, as all three pairings have some fantastic jokes. From Ripper really rippering it up to the point of convincing Millie to sabotage Priya in hopes of repairing their friendship, Damien just getting pulled around by an even more so than usual tryhard Priya, and best of all, Julia just not helping Bowie at all. All three of these interactions are hilarious and help to add some flavor to an otherwise boring finale. The lava reveal does make Millie sabotage even funnier, and while I get that they didn't have a ton of time, it's hard to describe her makeup session with Priya as anything but rushed, as she gets out of the way of what turns out to be a fairly boring finale. Just like nearly every other finale in the show, the season ends with two characters who really don't have a dynamic, and since the show wants to play coy and have two different winners, no one's allowed to have a character arc that involves whether or not they win, nor can we get more than a few seconds of people reacting to the winner. While at the time of me recording this, we have yet to see Bowie's win, given that he was the main strategist of the season while Priya's win just validated her parents' decisions, I think I'm going to end up preferring a Bowie W, but I can't quite say for sure yet. What I can say though is that the announcement of the rematch, followed by the dance party with some hilariously stiff animation, feels like the epitome of the season. Awkward, but fun. While this season was never going to be as good as World Tour, it just simply didn't have a chance in a 13 episode season with an all new cast, it does genuinely feel like the most fun the show has been since the original Island season, and it kind of made me realize how much I miss that summer camp vibe. While the feeling of watching that original season can never be replicated, I think that this season does as good of a job as anyone could have ever really expected, as while yes, some things are rushed, and yes, some things feel awkward after 15 years, this season's ability to translate the format in such an interesting way with more hits than misses makes for a genuinely good season, and a great setup for an even better follow-up, which results in one of the most surprisingly good reboots to come out of this reboot-heavy era of cartoons that we're currently in. So yeah, while I hope that you didn't watch this entire video before watching the season, if you somehow did, I hope that you check out the season, and if you have already seen the season, I hope that you consider watching it again when it comes out legally, or at least letting it go on in the background. This season shows that the series can still work, so I would hate all of the potential to be wasted because the distribution was so jank and the viewership numbers are going to end up being lower than they actually should be. Anyway, that's going to be about it for me. Sorry this video took a while. I definitely wanted to come out closer to the release of the season, but the timing was bad with it coming out right after the Owl House finale, and I wanted to make sure that I gave this season the full rundown it deserved, since Total Drama isn't really a good fit for the shorter videos that I make, so this is likely the last time I'll ever talk about the season until the follow-up comes out. If you want to yell at me about enjoying Ripper or complaining about Emma and Chase, you can find my Twitter in the description, where you can also just see what I'm working on next. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a video that's either going to be my worst or my best one yet. Thanks for watching.